So welcome everyone to tonight's constitutional conversation. It's what depending on how you count them, the second or third of this academic year. And we've been focusing on issues related to constitutional law and the upcoming presidential election. And in that vein, it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker for this evening, Professor Justin Grimmer. Justin is fairly new to Stanford. He is an associate professor of political science, and he specializes in empirical work having to do with both voter behavior and also representation, how politicians and especially members of Congress communicate and represent themselves to voters, and also how various measures affect voting behavior. And so, what could be more interesting to find out the real facts? Many of us have uninformed opinions about all of these things, but it'll be nice to learn a little bit about what the empirical evidence says. So please join me in welcoming Professor Grimmer this evening. And let me just point out that he'll be speaking for 25 minutes, half an hour, something along those lines. And then we'll have the last half of the conversation open to your questions and comments. Please send those in the chat function, and Chaz Tyler will be monitoring that and sort of grouping them and organizing them, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion then in the last half. So send those comments and questions in the chat. So, Justin, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here and to talk with everyone, and I look forward to your questions. And so today I want to talk to you about the effect of voter identification laws and photo identification laws on individuals' turnout decisions. And so perhaps I don't have to tell this audience that there has been already substantial attention this election to the issue of either voter suppression or voter security. And so it's perhaps going to be common in a few weeks when people turn out on election day, or perhaps as they turn out now, to see photos like this where they're asking individuals to show photo identification. In fact, one of the big stories when it comes to election administration over the last 15 to 20 years has been the incredible increase in the number of states that require some form of identification in order to cast a vote. In fact, what you can see here in these blue states, the sort of like light blue states, are a series of states that have what we might call strict photo identification. That is, they require a government-issued identification in order to cast a ballot. And of course, this sometimes, if I'm discussing this with grad students, perhaps from the United States, they're like, "Oh, perhaps this makes sense because you want to keep security." But of course, there's a number of, I think, serious issues here with the rollout of these photo identification laws, perhaps best captured by this editorial cartoon, where you see here an individual who's got a starting gun labeled as the GOP. And an older woman identified here to represent minorities, and seeing a series of hurdles that this individual has to clear in order to finally cast a vote. And so individuals on the left, and in particular Democrats, have argued that things like photo identification laws present hurdles to voters. And as we'll see, because individuals who are older and minorities disproportionately do not have photo identification. And as a result, the burdens of these laws fall disproportionately on these individuals, and who, by the way, also often tend to be constituents of the Democratic Party. On the other hand, you see Republicans either arguing that voter identification laws are necessary in order to prevent voter fraud. Of course, there's not very high rates of voter fraud within the United States, at least documented across either academic studies or if you look at individuals who receive criminal charges for voter fraud. But nonetheless, there's also an argument that these voter identification laws don't matter all that much. And so in fact, here we see a column arguing that voter identification laws really just aren't all that important because their effect is relatively narrow. This sort of popular debate with warring sides about the relative effect of various identification laws, and more generally about the role of voter suppression, is in fact mirrored in the academic literature. And so you might turn to a paper such as Benjamin Hyten, who's a professor at UC Davis, who wrote in a piece that was meant to offer an objective summary of the literature. He says, empirically, a small number of studies have employed suitable research designs and generally find modest, if any, turnout effects of voter identification laws. On the other hand, other studies suggest that voter identification laws do in fact have a large effect. So here we see a quote here from Zoltan Heinel, Nazita Lajavardi, and Lindsay Nielsen. In their paper, they say, the analysis shows that strict identification laws have a differentially negative impact on the turnout of racial and ethnic minorities in primaries and general elections. And of course, like any academic debate, you could have this volleyed over the net back and forth. And so Contini and Pons say in their paper, the working paper currently under review at an economics journal, that strict voter laws don't stop voters. In fact, they find a series of null effects of these laws. And so this seems to offer a set of competing empirical results. So my goal in this talk is going to be to reconcile these findings. And that is, I'm going to try to offer a coherent story about how we can understand what voter identification laws do to turnout rates in American elections. And to do that, I'm going to piece together two separate papers and tell hopefully a coherent story for you. First, we're going to engage with this finding that received quite a bit of attention when it came out, with the claim that this was the definitive proof that voter identification laws deterred minority voters. And what we show in this paper that I authored with a broad set of colleagues is that this study's conclusions are in fact based on some data errors and some modeling mistakes. I'll be able to explain those to you, and you'll see very clearly how they reach their conclusions. Once you correct those errors, though, it isn't as if we find a null effect. What we find in that paper is that these data just are not really quite suitable to assessing the effect of voter identification laws. And so in subsequent work with my excellent grad student, Jesse Yoder, we do a different study to assess whether voter ID laws actually deter those voters without identification. And here what we do is we examine the case of North Carolina. And we do this because in North Carolina, the law, a voter identification law, is implemented for a primary election and then repealed in a general election. And what we're going to be able to show is that in that primary election, it is the case that the voter identification law deters voters. And we'll show this occurs both through what we'll call a mechanical effect. Individuals show up to the polls without photo identification and are therefore cast away from the polls and not able to cast their ballot. But also because of a deterrent effect, individuals choose not to turn out to vote. Now, the size of this effect, I think, is important, and why I said it's a narrow effect. So we'll see that even though this is a real effect, an effect that we can detect, this affects only about 0.1% of the primary electorate, or about 2,500 votes. But we'll show critically that even after the law is removed, the deterrent effect of this law is going to persist. And as a result of this, individuals without photo identification will be less likely to turn out to vote. And we have good evidence this is a causal effect. They'll be causally less likely to turn out to vote. This deters, though, a small number of voters on the order of 3,100 votes, or about 0.06% of the general electorate. So what does this mean? It means that voter ID laws do in fact have a deterrent effect, but it's narrow in the sense that it isn't pushing away large numbers of voters. It's a relatively small number of voters, at least under the estimates that we produce here. But critically, this effect is also durable. It's not an effect that we're going to be able to remedy merely by overturning a law and increasing access to the polls, but rather, even after a law is overturned, we're going to see that the effect of this law is going to remain in place. And so if we're thinking about ways in which to increase turnout, there's a number of reforms that I think are possible that would ensure security and increase this turnout. But critically, we're going to have to deal with the informational effects of these ID laws on individuals' turnout decisions. Okay, so let's dive right in here because I got a lot of ground to cover. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to engage with this paper that made what I think was a pretty startling claim. Indeed, it's what got me interested in researching on this topic. And so it comes from this 2017 paper published in one of the top political science journals. We'll call it HLN from hereafter, Heinel, Lajavardi, and Nielsen. And what they argue is that voter ID laws suppress the turnout of minority voters. So what they do here to overcome what they say are obstacles in prior studies is they estimate the effect of the voter ID laws using survey data, which they then merge with information from the states. And what they argue is that because they have a large pool of survey data, comes from one of the biggest surveys in political science, that this enables them to offer a more definitive assessment of the effect of voter identification laws than prior studies have been able to offer. And what they find, I think, is a pretty interesting pair of findings. First, they show in their paper that in the general election, Hispanic eligible voters are deterred. But then in the primary election, they show that Hispanic, Black, and Asian eligible voters are all deterred. And so they argue that this is definitive evidence of the disproportionate deterrent effect of voter identification laws. And so, as I said, this paper drew me into this. And so I read a report about this paper in a prominent outlet that sort of blogs about political science papers, and they had written a brief post about it. And I saw what were quite large effects. I had just recently prepared some work for a class going over the various effects of mobilization efforts. And so I had some understanding of what the most effective mobilization efforts were in political science. And I was surprised by the size of this effect. So I then emailed two of the other study co-authors, Clayton Nall and Eitan Hirsch, who also happen to be good friends of mine. I said, hey, isn't this a big effect? Both of them were much more focused on actually getting work done. And so they quickly emailed me back. They're like, why don't you go read the paper, Justin, rather than just emailing us. So I go read the paper, and I go to the best design in the paper, and I see something that I found to be quite surprising. So I looked at this table here, which is the best design from the paper. And just in case you don't read regression tables all day like I have to do, let's just walk through it. And so the first thing to notice here is that according to this specification, a strict voter ID law would increase white turnout by almost 11 percentage points. I found that to be very surprising. And then as you look down the table, you have to add these coefficients together. And what you'd find in adding these coefficients together is that, in fact, according to this table, according to their evidence, voter identification laws increase turnout across the board for both white and minority voters. In fact, if you do that addition together, we can see that according to this paper's conclusions, voter identification laws are an incredible voter mobilization effort. Well, at this point, I was like, oh, surely I'm interpreting the table wrong. So I walked away, had lunch, had a meeting, came back and saw that I'm reading the paper again, emailed Clayton and Eitan again, and all of a sudden they were much more interested in what I had to say. In fact, Clayton, who was working at Stanford at the time, comes running down the hall and he's like, oh my gosh, this is a big problem if they're publishing these results. And so we wanted to dig in and understand what was going on. And so what we were able to see is that these results are not an actual credible estimate of voter identification laws somehow increasing turnout. Instead, what's going on here is that this is the result of a particular kind of statistical error. And in particular, what I'll show you is that this is due to a merge error in the data. And I just want to be super clear here, because occasionally this came up in various exchanges around this. My research team is not arguing that voter ID laws increase turnout. In fact, I don't really know of anyone who argues voter ID laws increase turnout. There's one psychological mechanism you might expect. It might get people very interested in knowing that people are trying to block their vote, and therefore they have lots of energy and anger, which pushes them to the polls. But even the strongest defender of voter identification laws don't argue that it increases turnout. That's not what we're doing here. Okay, so how is it that they were able to get this particular result? Well, to understand what happened here, I think we just have to look at one particular state. And in particular, the merge error happens in the state of Virginia with its turnout rates. And so the best model in this paper uses a particular statistical technique called a difference in differences. So how does that work? Well, in a difference in differences, the idea is first, you compute the change in a state before and after a particular law is implemented. That's for the treated states. For states where photo identification laws are allocated, where they're put in place. And then states where strict photo identification laws aren't put in place, you make the same difference. And then you take that, so that's the first difference. And then you take the difference between those differences, and that gives you an estimate of the causal effect of the photo identification laws. Take into account things in the state that don't tend to change. You might think about that as like state culture is going to be taken care of with this design. So what we can see here with Virginia is that due to a merge error in their data, the data said that the turnout rate in Virginia in 2006 and 2008 was 0%. So according to their data, no one turned out to vote in those 2 years. In 2010, they actually just don't have anyone from Virginia in their data. That happens to be the year the strict ID law is passed. And then in 2012 and 14, this merge error is resolved. And as a result of that, we see Virginia return to a reasonable estimate of what the Virginia turnout rate is. But of course, if we think through what those differences are doing, we're now estimating something like a 70% turnout rate after the law is in place and a 0% before. And not surprisingly, it looks like there's some huge effect from certain identification laws driving everybody to the polls in Virginia. And as a result of this, that drags those coefficients up. And we get this incorrect result about this increase in turnout driving the conclusions in that paper. And in fact, just to make sure we all know that this is what happens, so you can go state by state, you can drop a state from the analysis and recompute everything. And if you recompute everything, you can see that by and large, you end up with positive estimates if Virginia is included. And then you can see down here on the horizontal axis, for each racial group, we see that you get the negative estimate of voter identification laws overall if you drop Virginia from the analysis. So that's really what's driving this result. Okay, so that's the big thing that's wrong with the data. We identified a number of the series errors in the papers, cleaned that up, and cleaned up some model specifications. And we might ask, okay, well, what conclusion can we reach then? So if you reanalyze the data, here I'm just showing this for individuals who identify as white or Hispanic in their response, we can see that according to a variety of specifications, we could end up with positive or negative results. And oftentimes we end up with results that are basically null. And so what we conclude from this analysis is that we can't learn all that much about the effect of voter identification laws by using the survey design. I would just add that this isn't all that unexpected. In fact, prior studies have suggested that in this sort of design, we're not going to have a lot of statistical power in order to detect the effect of identification laws. And that's because effectively when a law is allocated at the state level, that's only one unit. So you have a very small number of units in effect here. The initial variation within a state doesn't help you very much statistically. So what can we do? So with having written that paper, it's a rather unsatisfying paper because it just sort of says, well, we don't know, in an instance where we thought we did know. And so in this newer paper, what we do is we use information about voter turnout in North Carolina in order to better understand the various pathways that voter identification laws could deter individuals from voting. And we take advantage of a particular institutional setting to get a sense of what's going on with the information effects of this and the mechanical effects of this. So in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to see that voter ID laws can deter voters. What we're going to argue in this paper is that voter ID laws can deter voters in two ways. Perhaps the most obvious way is that there could be a mechanical effect. That is, voters could be rejected for a lack of identification at the polls. And this has been discussed in a couple other papers where people have measured the rate at which this mechanical effect occurs. But there could be a broader effect, which we call a deterrent effect. So one of the effects of voter identification laws is that it could sow confusion among the electorate. And because of that confusion among the electorate, individuals choose not to turn out to vote. And so what we're going to estimate in this paper is the differential deterrent effect. That is, how much more deterred are individuals who the state of North Carolina says doesn't have identification when they decide to turn out to vote. So some questions that we're going to try to answer in this paper and then what our answers are. So the first thing we might ask is, do strict ID laws deter people without identification from voting? The answer is yes. And I want to be clear here, we don't find heterogeneity in the effect of this law. That is, if you don't have identification and you're, say, a Democrat or a racial minority, it isn't the case that you're differentially deterred by your lack of identification. But it is, in fact, the case that we find that the effect is concentrated among Democrats and racial minorities. And that's because these individuals are disproportionately likely to not have identification. And then what we show is that there's this mechanical and deterrent channel. Both matter for understanding the effect of this. But crucially, this deterrent effect is going to linger even after the voter ID laws are repealed. So I'm going to show you some results here from that same general election, but the result actually persists into 2018 as well. All right, so just so we're all clear on what happens in North Carolina here, in 2013, North Carolina passed a strict photo identification law. This is going to be implemented at the first time in the 2016 primary. In February of 2016, the state sends a mailer to everyone that they've identified who's on the voter rolls who doesn't have state-issued identification, right? And it informs those individuals that they need identification in order to vote. And then in March of 2016, there's the North Carolina primary, and their photo identification is going to be required. So that's going to enable us to estimate this mechanical effect of the law. That is how many people are deterred because they are unable to show identification at the poll. Then in July of 2016, a US appellate court is going to strike down this law and going to say that the identification law can't be held in place. And so as a result, in November for the general election, the photo identification law is not in place. And as a result of this, individuals without identification can turn out to vote. They need not show it at the polling place. And so what we can see here is that for the primary election, we'll have that mechanical effect in place. We'll be able to see how many people are deterred by their lack of identification, but not for the general. But we're going to argue that in both the primary and the general election, there's this deterrent effect. That is, individuals could be confused about what's required to vote or may not want to turn out because they're unsure if they have that. And we're going to estimate that in both elections. Okay, so estimating this mechanical effect in the 2016 primary is relatively straightforward. What we're going to do is we're just going to look at the number of individuals who are turned away at the polls, that is, their provisional ballots are rejected because they lack identification. And so over here in this figure, I have on the vertical axis the share of provisional ballots, and on the horizontal axis, I just have various elections. And so you can see that there are, in fact, non-zero numbers of individuals who have their provisional ballot rejected because they lack identification. Under the Help America Vote Act, it is possible to have to show identification under the HAVA requirements. If you didn't show it when you registered, or if your signature is not matching, they can ask for identification there. And then we can see in the 2016 election, there's this sharp increase where there's 1,169 provisional ballots rejected for lack of identification. By 2018, that returns back to the very close to what it was before because of these HAVA minimums. So that 1,169 provisional ballots amounts for about 0.05% of all votes cast statewide. Now to open this up, more broadly to think about how would we increase turnout and how could you get more people out to the polls, you can see that one of the biggest impediments to voting is, in fact, individuals not being registered to vote. And we can see this here with the top line. If you want to look at the majority reason that provisional ballots are rejected, it's because individuals cast votes when they are not, in fact, registered to vote. So we can see the registration requirement appears to be a much bigger impediment than the lack of photo identification here, at least in this mechanical sense. But of course, as I said, we also want to capture this broader effect of the law, this deterrent effect. And so we define this to be the differential effect of the law for individuals without identification relative to those who do have identification. And I want to be clear that all of our estimates here are not going to be able to distinguish a setting where everyone's probability of turning out to vote goes down, or there's effect among individuals both with and without identification. We're looking for this differential effect. I think this is a relevant and interesting effect, particularly given the mailers that were sent out when the law was put in place in February, but not critically when the law was overturned in the appellate court in July. So we'll estimate this deterrent effect. How will we do this? Well, we're going to do this by looking at some administrative data. My co-author, Jesse, is probably the greatest data merger I've ever worked with, and so he deserves all the credit for this. It was a spectacular job. So we have the North Carolina voter file. We then merged in a North Carolina determined measure of who has photo identification. This North Carolina voter file is nice because it gives us voting history, age, race, and turnout. And actually, as an advantage over other administrative records, we know individuals who have been purged from the file as well, ensuring that our results aren't biased because of who is maintained in the voter file. This North Carolina measure of identification is individuals who do not have the identification and then received a mailer from the state. Helpfully, there's a unique ID to help us merge the two files. Of course, it requires some additional work than that. The design here is going to be one that's relatively standard across a number of political science, economics, policy evaluation type articles. And so we're going to use a difference in differences approach. One difference that we'll talk about here is that we're going to use individuals who have comparable prior voting histories rather than the usual thing, which would be to account for every individual with what's called an individual fixed effect. For those that are interested, the reason to use this matching strategy is that these files sometimes contain what's called deadwood, or individuals who have, say, moved away without updating their registration status. If that's the case, doing something that has individual fixed effects would obviously violate a parallel trends assumption, but our matching on this pre-treatment turnout history enables us to distinguish these individuals, we think, quite well. And in fact, you can see the estimates shrink considerably in our paper as we go to this much more stringent estimation strategy. So what do we conclude from this? Well, what we learned is that the law caused a decrease in turnout for individuals without identification in the primary and in the general election, even after the law was repealed. So in the primary election, we see a 1 percentage point decrease in the turnout rate. In the general election, we see a slightly bigger effect, even though the law is not in place. Why is that? Well, in the primary election, there's already, I would argue, a higher bar for participation. There's lower levels of turnout in a primary election. In a general election, you get a much broader pool of individuals. So it's more likely that the kind of person who doesn't have photo identification would, in fact, turn out to vote in a general election. And as a result of that, it avoids the sort of floor effects we see in the primary. And so we get this 2.6 percentage point decrease in turnout due to the law in the general election. So what we can see is that this effect is concentrated among individuals who are occasional voters before the law was put in place. Critically, we don't see any across race or party heterogeneity in its effect. And again, I just want to remind everyone that doesn't mean that the law doesn't disproportionately burden some individuals. We don't see the effect concentrated. And that's because the holding or not photo identification is not, of course, randomly assigned across the population. And that's what this next point says. Okay, so we can, under some assumptions, we can compute some numbers here, which I think is helpful. And so what we see in the primary election, where we can add up both that mechanical and deterrent effect, that's something on the order of 2,500 votes are deterred. Whereas in the general election, it's just south of 3,100 votes under these assumptions. Of course, I think a very reasonable normative argument that we can make at this point is that, you know, any vote any person that's being prevented to vote is one too many. And I think that that's a completely justifiable normative position. Someone else may say that this is a reasonable cost to pay for additional electoral security. Again, that I'm happy to discuss these sort of competing normative claims. I have my own stake in it, but I don't want to prejudge anyone else's normative claims on this interpretation. But what I do want to point out is that the overall effect on the electorate is relatively small. And so, of course, we could all imagine elections that hinge on something like 3,000 votes. But of course, that's a very rare election, 3,000 votes statewide. It would be quite surprising to have an election determined by that. And so while it is the case that individuals turn out to vote, that's why I say this is a narrow effect. Because the total number of voters who are deterred, at least under this specification, is a relatively small number, and certainly smaller than, say, what was estimated in that HLN paper. And so just to conclude and to get to some questions, which I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about, what I want to argue, and what we argue across these papers, is that there's really two claims in the voter identification literature, and both can be true. First, it could be the case that voter ID laws reduce turnout among those without identification, and that these burdens can be concentrated on minorities and Democratic voters. And it could also be true that the voter identification laws have small and difficult to detect effects on overall turnout, even among various subgroups. The key idea here is that we're able to detect these effects when we know who has identification and not. And we go to a setting where there's less statistical power, where we look in the aggregate what happens to turnout rates. Because these effects are relatively small, it becomes difficult for us to detect them. So it's not to say that no one's deterred. It's just to say that we're not able, under the designs like the very nice Contini and Pons paper, excellent paper, It's just not able to detect the very precise and narrow effects that we talk about here. I think this work has a number of takeaways for researchers, but I thought this might be a more policy-oriented audience. And so just two key takeaways that comes from this narrow focus on identification, but of course I'm happy to talk about voter turnout and vote suppression more generally. The first is that even after these, a photo identification law could be overturned, it could be the case that voters lack the relevant information and could be deterred by some incorrect beliefs. I think this is particularly likely in North Carolina, where voters literally received a mailer that said you need identification to vote. And unless they're paying attention to election administration law decisions in July of 2016, perhaps they're unlikely to find out that they no longer need that photo identification. Maybe the campaigns can tell them, but maybe it's hard for them to find that out from the campaigns. And so I think one of the big things that would be useful for policymakers to think about, and perhaps for the courts to think about, is how to inform voters about changing requirements so that when individuals make a decision to turn out to vote or not, they have the full information about what will be required in order to cast their ballot. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm very excited to take your questions. So I'm going to stop the screen share and then happy to hear what you all have to say.
Thanks very much, Justin. So let me start here. And this is sort of maybe two different questions, but I think they're motivated by the same sort of concerns. So the person asks, they say that use the word deter to describe the effect of strict voter ID on turnout. And then one of your slides uses the word eligible when referring to voters. So the first question they have is, how do you control for the effect of voter ID laws on incidents of voter fraud? And then the second is do you think that the voter ID requirement is doing what it's theoretically supposed to do? I think the kind of implied premise there is that it's supposed to prevent fraud.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting questions. So I'm just noticing from the question in the chat that this person served as an election monitor and observed some instances of people casting ballots for other people. The sort of best estimate from a lot of political science work is that this is exceedingly rare behavior to see individuals engaging in this sort of outright fraud. There's some theoretical reasons to think that it might be rare. So any one vote's not actually all that valuable in an election. In fact, the sort of key puzzle in political science is why would individuals turn out at all? Because votes are often effectively don't inform the final total at all. So the estimates that I've seen on voter fraud, people try to measure it in various ways, that it gets very close to zero. And so a question could be, how do we adjust for fraud? And so if it were more prevalent, if there were more individuals casting votes for ineligible persons, I think that would potentially be a bigger deterrent, a bigger issue for this analysis. But even if there's some small number of people doing that, it would have to be it would have to be much larger, I think, to substantially bias the effects. And so just thinking through the analysis here, it would mean that we're underestimating the effect in the general election where the photo identification law is not in place. So thinking a little bit about like what goes on in the polling place, I think is a very interesting thing. And as the question asker had volunteered, which is a great thing, and thank you for doing that, for volunteering an election. I think you can often see, particularly in the state of California, people want to hand over their identification. It seems like almost reflexive. And I started the talk by telling the story about some grad students who are not from the United States. And it was 2018, we were walking over to class and they were discussing, voting with me, and I had just voted. And we were discussing the photo identification laws because they knew I was engaged in some of this research. And they were just gobsmacked that you didn't have to provide photo identification. And so I think, that's, do I think the photo identification laws deter fraud? On the one hand, it seems like oftentimes people think they're quite reasonable laws to have in place. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like there's all that much fraud happening in American elections to deter. Of course, that could be because individuals have some uncertainty about fraud, but at the moment, it doesn't look like there's all that much. And, just to expand on this question a little bit more, because I think it's a really interesting one, there's this sort of famous paper that gets picked up a lot by, say, President Trump and various people in the administration about non-citizens voting. And the argument that they make in that paper is that there's actually a surprisingly high rate of non-citizens voting in elections. That paper suffers from a very interesting sort of basic statistical issue, which is that if you survey people and there's some behavior that's relatively rare, in this case it's non-citizens voting, it's much more likely that the positive cases that you get, the instances in your survey where people say they're non-citizens who voted, are people who essentially misclick on your web form. And so if you go back and re-interview those people, it turns out almost all of them are in fact citizens, or they're non-citizens who didn't in fact vote. And so overall, I don't think voter identification laws do much to deter fraud, because there's not too much fraud to deter. Of course, you know, it could be a completely different setting with vote by mail, which is, I think, in general, an interesting issue with lots of different possibilities there.
So do we have any sort of empirical sense about how many people who do not have IDs would otherwise be eligible to vote?
There is, and so the best evidence of this comes from a paper by Steve Ensel-Behair and Eitan Hirsch, who Eitan is one of the co-authors on the first paper I presented. And in Texas, I believe they estimate it's in the numbers of, you know, hundreds of thousands. So it is the case that many people, in fact, the vast majority of people have IDs, but nonetheless, there is still a relatively large pool of people who lack identification would be eligible. One of the reasons you get the really small effects that we're seeing here is that the individuals who lack identification tend to be lower socioeconomic status and perhaps much older. They don't have a car, so it's hard for them to get around. So at a baseline, they're really low turnout rates anyways. And so if you think about the causal effect of something, if somebody's already turning out at a very low rate, it's hard to pull it down much more than they already are. And that's why you end up with these relatively small effects.
So maybe I'll just lump together two sort of clarificatory questions that we got. So one was somebody who wanted you to explain the concept of data merger.
Oh, yeah.
And then there was another one, which was, could you explain the concept of merge error? And then maybe I'll hold the other clarification question for later.
Okay, yeah, okay. So the merge error is what happened when that was the reason that we had 0% turnout, or that their data had 0% turnout in Virginia. What they were trying to do is take individuals who responded to a survey and link them to the voter file. And that was the merge that was happening. So they're trying to get validated voter turnout. That failed. That merge failed. And as a result of that, it looked like 0% of the people in Virginia turned out to vote. So that's what I mean by the merge error. Can you ask the first question again? I think I maybe missed it.
It was explaining the concept of I think it was data merger. So I think maybe you were taking, you were combining data sources and then.
Oh yeah. So so that was a sort of offhand about how awesome Jesse is. And so it's often the case, increasingly in political science, people use what's called administrative data sources. So there's a number of publicly available data sources that provide these comprehensive records of things like people turning out to vote, say, or homeowners. And what we often want to do is link these data sources across records. So we want to know who turned out to vote and who owns a home and who spoke at a public meeting. That turns out to be a very complicated data merging exercise. We have to know that the Justin Grimmer who spoke at the meeting is the Justin Grimmer who lives in Stanford, California, and the Justin Grimmer who's, you know, bounced around all over the country on voter identification laws, and you got to try to piece those together, or voter rolls. So got to piece that together. That's what I mean by data merger.
So there were a couple of people that wanted to know whether you knew whether the diminishment in voter turnout that you detected had any effect on outcomes.
That's a great question. Okay, so my initial answer would be no. And the reason for that is, just think, first off, you'd have to have a statewide race in California that's decided by less than 3,000 votes. But it's actually closer than that, because the 3,000 votes would assume that everyone who is deterred would have voted for a particular candidate. And so that assumes, for example, that everyone who's deterred is a Democrat and would have voted for the Democratic candidate. Quite likely, even if it's, say, 70-30, now we're in a situation where it's a much smaller margin. It's like 1,200 votes or something that a candidate's missing out on, 1,200 vote margin from that group. And as a result of that, I don't think there was anybody in 2016 North Carolina who lost by less than 1,200. Although if someone sees that in the chat and wants to correct me, I'd be happily corrected.
You may have covered this, and I just missed it. But one of the questions in the chat is about how you control for the differences between a general and a primary when you're using that as part of your analysis.
Absolutely. So basically, what we're doing when we're thinking about the general and primaries, we just want to be sure that we have a good baseline model in place. And so when we're modeling out the primary electorate, we really want to be sure that we're including prior turnout history and primaries. The general election, you want to include both primary and general election turnout histories. So it turns out there's relatively similar models for both, enables us to get good baseline specifications on individuals' turnout rates for those races.
And do we have any evidence about how this, the effects that you identified might affect local and district level elections as opposed to state level elections?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So inevitably, if we're sort of allocating these individuals across districts, you saw that same aggregate amount of state level turnout, but of course now you're dividing it off over congressional districts. So you're looking at even smaller numbers of total people deterred in that congressional district. And so while it's certainly the case, that I've written a paper about close elections in congressional history, there are congressional elections that have been decided by 12 votes. Those are very rare. So even close elections now, we usually think about as being in 1 to 5,000 vote territory. So it's, I think, always theoretically feasible that this determined a race. I would just also suggest, though, that there's a number of normative frameworks that we could use to think about the effect of these laws and how we should think about their implementation. And I think that we should care about these laws even if they tend not to affect the results of elections all that much. And so I guess, sort of putting my normative hat on, it's really important for individuals to have that right to be able to cast their vote. And of course, there's perhaps a number of representation dynamics. If elected officials view a group as being less likely to turn out, that could have implications for the way the elected official conducts themselves. And it also, of course, these laws, perhaps on both sides of the aisle, could sow distrust in the electoral system, which I think we're seeing in spades this election, which could be abrasive to democracy.
Another question is, how do experts measure the frequency of voter fraud? It seems like you might have an issue where you're not getting the kind of evidence you're not getting reliable evidence because you don't know how many instances are actually occurring if you don't detect them.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a great question. So there's a whole bunch of perhaps voter fraud that would be very difficult to ascertain. So I think the great question about the person who worked at the polls, it's like, well, somebody comes in and casts a vote for someone else. So if you go in and you vote, for your partner and rather than yourself, then of course that's going to be very difficult to detect. And in fact, the person could have been eligible. Maybe you're not eligible to vote, your partner is, and they're off working or something like that. So it's very difficult to detect. So the clearest empirical attempts that I've seen are this non-citizens voting result that I described before. So there you would know individuals who are potentially non-citizens and who can vote. And there's two ways that's been done. So one way is with the survey. Another way people have done this is by trying to link up the voter rolls to individuals who are likely to be non-citizens. And I'd say in both instances, despite the initial conclusions from the research team that tried to do it, they were not successful in identifying lots of individuals who were ineligible to vote and who in fact had registered to vote and then casted that vote. There's a second way that people have done this, and I'm reluctant to bring it up because it's going to sound a little gimmicky and crazy. And so I just want to be clear that this is a grain of salt. And then we could talk about the third way that we perhaps know this is that if people are doing it, they're very good at getting away with it because it's just not a high prevalence thing. So the second way, again, with the grain of salt, political scientists use this technique called a list experiment. And so the list experiment goes something like this. Suppose there's some behavior that you might engage in and I want to figure out if you do it, but I think you'll be reluctant to tell me if that you actually engage in the behavior. So, if I'm talking to my grad students, it'd be like, how many nights a week are you playing like League of Legends or something, like a video game? I need to, like, because I want you to be working and they're not. Okay. So what do you do with a list experiment? So in the list experiment, you give people a list of activities. They range from things that are great to do, like exercising or working. And then they'll have the activity that you don't want people to know that you're doing. In this case, it would be committing voter fraud. And then you say, okay, how many on this list have you done? And then in a control condition, you have that same list, but without the voter fraud option. And then you make a comparison between the treatment and control groups on the difference in number. And that enables you to perhaps back out the number of people who've committed voter fraud. So the reason I say with a grain of salt is because, of course, you might say like, well, if you've committed something that's a felony, maybe you don't even want to be truthful if you're adding it up because you don't know what kind of, statistical wizards on the other side who's going to figure something out, which I think is a perhaps reasonable objection. So the splashy finding from the paper that tries to do this with the list experiment is that there's more people who say they've been abducted by aliens than committed voter fraud. Of course, that's like for lots of reasons, like not a like serious finding, but across these different data sources, it sure looks like there's not high rates of fraud happening. If we go look at, popular claims of voter fraud that's made, say, President Trump's made a number of claims about voter fraud. For example, a large number in California after the last election, that was based on these non-citizen voting numbers. And those non-citizen voting numbers have been both soundly rejected by political scientists, including various serious people who aren't just sort of got an ideological slant to their work. People have looked at it, doesn't make sense. And the courts have largely rejected that analysis as well as a number. So that's sort of long and winding. We'd be, if there's like ways that people in the audience think about how to measure it, we'd be open to trying it out, certainly in my lab group.
So these are maybe related questions. One person says if there's little evidence of fraud and little evidence of impact on the outcome of elections, then why is this voter ID thing such a big deal? Mm-hmm. And do you have any recommendations of how to, resolving it in a way that makes it less of a big deal? And I think maybe this is related. As somebody says, are there good ballot security measures that we could implement that, that don't suppress votes, but that are equally effective at preventing wrongful voting?
These are great questions. So on this first question, I have my sort of what I would describe as like a pet theory of the sort of politics of this. And so I think on both the Republican side and the Democratic side, there's a basic understanding that what they're talking about here is some very small margins. But I do think that there is the potential when Republicans say that there's voter fraud to get their base sort of very excited about turning out to vote and think that it's quite important for them to turn out to vote. And this is a good mobilization message for them. In comparison, and there's actual political science evidence for this claim that when Republicans advance voter identification laws and Democrats say, oh, they're suppressing the vote, I think that's also a mobilization message for Democrats, and it gets Democrats angry and excited to turn out to vote. So I think one component of what's going on here is that you have both sides realizing that this is a way to mobilize voters and to get their side, very amped up, excited about the election. And so that's one potential reason. I think another reason, so that's a very cynical reason, I should say. So let's do a less cynical take on this. The less cynical take on this is Republicans legitimately believe that there's voter fraud happening, and they're very concerned about it, and they view voter identification laws as a reasonable approach to prevent that fraud. And I think they perhaps view that any fraudulent ballot is one too many because it's canceling out the legitimate ballot of some person who's eligible. On the other side, Democrats could legitimately believe that voter identification laws are deterring people from voting, and that one person who's deterred is one too many, and so they want to invest efforts in making sure those people can turn out to vote. I should add, it also could be the case that what we're observing across these papers where we don't see big effects could be this just sort of initial reaction to these initial flood of identification laws. If campaigns can't engage in, say, some compensatory effort in order to keep people turning out to vote despite the presence of these laws, perhaps in the future we could see them have a much bigger effect, which could also explain why people would be so excited about them and want to see them not put in place. On the ballot security measures, I think that's a great question. One of the things that I think I'm regularly impressed with is how secure a number of different components of the electoral process are already. So, for example, vote by mail regularly pilloried in the media, but there's actually like barcodes in place, and so there's some components in there. Of course, it doesn't stop someone else from filling out another person's ballot. I think there's a bunch of interesting issues around that. I know less about the security measures, so I don't mean to punt on that, but I'm sort of less expertise there. I would say that if we wanted to think about what are the high margin areas to increase turnout, if we were thinking about that, the sort of two that I like to discuss in these settings is the fact that felons can't vote. That would be if felons had the right to vote, you would see an incredible number of people turning out to vote. And in fact, studies of that suggest that's would have a much less partisan effect than I think some people believe it would. So there's a study of this in Florida that suggests it's got a more partisan balance than people anticipated. And then of course, making it easier for people to register to vote seems to be the big impediment to participation in American politics.
These are two clarifications about just the data that you presented. So one question is, in North Carolina, is what you concluded that in North Carolina we saw a 0.6 reduction in turnout with respect to the electorate, but a 2.6 reduction with respect to the actual voters?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we think about this, the thing that we are measuring the effect of is not having photo identification, according to North Carolina. So among individuals, if we were to sort of take someone and randomly make them not have photo identification, the average effect of that would be 2.6 percentage points. But a very small proportion of the electorate in North Carolina fails to have identification. So as a result of that, you end up with this overall effect on the electorate of 0.06%. So it's, I would say, put that way, it sounds quite small. And so it's a very narrow effect on the electorate.
Somebody wanted you to address this issue of ballot harvesting and whether you think there's a concern there. It's related to voter fraud.
It's a good question. And so I'm a little reluctant because I'd be stepping way far away from where I've done my empirical work. But I think the concern, as I understand it, is something like you have individuals going around collecting ballots and then turning them in, and what can go on the interim between collecting those ballots and turning them in is the potential to fill in the ballots for other people. I think there's do I think there's a lot of fraud that happened that way? I'd be surprised if there was much, but of course there's the possibility. I think overall there's this is now purely speculative. I want to be clear, like not saying there's evidence of this. I think there's interesting issues around vote by mail and the potential for coercion in casting votes. So just like two settings where I think this could be interesting and sort of balances out the sort of need to do it during a pandemic. So one, imagine that someone's in an abusive relationship, perhaps their partner imposes upon them how to vote. And then another, relatedly, there could be situations where there's elder abuse happening and someone could coerce someone to cast a vote. Of course, there could be coercion in other places, but there is, I guess, something that's distinct about casting a vote in a polling booth that sort of breaks that coercion in one way or another. I don't know. I guess I don't know the rate of fraud that goes along with ballot harvesting, so I'm sorry I can't directly answer that question.
And then just another clarificatory question. Could you just remind us what was the relative differential impact between Democrats and Republicans? Or I can't remember if you gave us data on that or not.
So I just said that there was a differential impact. So I think the rate of holding photo identification is quite high in North Carolina, but I think relatively, I'm going to blank on the numbers because I have it in front of me, but it's something on the order of the people who don't have identification, they're twice as likely to be Democrats of that magnitude, but that's not the exact number.
I see. So we would assume that the people who are deterred are, have that same, that sort of same difference.
Yeah, so because we don't find any heterogeneity, whether you're a Republican or Democrat or across racial groups, relatively constant effect of this law, that just means that when it like is applied to people, we would just see who is in this case treated, who doesn't have the photo identification. And so as a result of that, those are the groups that we'd expect that's where we'd expect to find the effect.
And somebody wanted to know if you have any knowledge you could share with us about how other countries manage this voter ID issue.
Absolutely, yeah. So in other countries, the job of the government is to keep people registered to vote, as I understand it. So in many other places, it's just like the burden is sort of flipped. Whereas in the United States, the burden's on the citizen. In many other countries, the burden's on the government to know where the citizens are and to ensure that they're able to vote. And so that's sort of like one short answer. Of course, other countries have requirements for national identification that the United States doesn't have. And so one could imagine if one wanted to put a national voter ID law in place and then aggressively trying to get everyone photo identification, perhaps that would mollify some of the critics. Of course, there's a whole bunch of ways in which that could be exceedingly difficult to do within the United States. But I think that would be the sort of parallel there.
Somebody said that they thought that it was really important that you found not just an effect, but a kind of one of your findings was this durability finding. They wanted to know whether you could infer anything about like particular persons or particular, say, communities, sort of diminished likelihood of voting over multiple generations.
Yeah. Okay. So we can take that on a couple ways. So first, we were able to extend this to the 2018 election, where the law was still not in place. And what we see there is that this effect persists, but it seems to be shrinking in size. So it goes from 2.6 to 1.5. Of course, that's also a midterm election, so perhaps the pool of people who are likely to turn out to vote is smaller. So you can imagine it's everyone sort of less likely to turn out in the midterm, but it was this historic midterm, lots of excitement around it. There's this other component to this, which is the sort of long run effects of these sorts of laws. And one regular finding in the American politics literature is folks use the phrase voting is habitual. I don't really quite like that because it's hard to think of a habit that occurs once every 2 to 4 years. But nevertheless, if someone's deterred from voting once, we could imagine that could persist in their turnout behavior in the future. And so you could imagine that being deterred even one election without identification could result in you not participating in future elections, which perhaps would disproportionately affect certain individuals, and we would suggest that it would. But again, given the sort of relatively narrow effects that we find, we'd be talking about a relatively small number of individuals who perhaps might have opted out of the system at some point anyways, because they moved, so they move around a lot in this particular group of people, or they could age out, they could have passed away.
I think probably we have time for one more. Somebody wrote that they had thought that they had read that there were some elections where there were more votes cast than there were voters who were registered.
Oh.
So maybe you're not aware of any such example, but the question is there a sort of non-fraud explanation for that?
Yeah, so there's two explanations. So if there's more votes cast than voters who are registered, I think this happens, I want to say the state's Wyoming. And Wyoming's got a super interesting, it's a mountain western state, but I believe it's Wyoming. So Wyoming says, if you don't turn out to vote, we're kicking you off the voter file. But if that's fine, because you can always register the day of the election. So if you look at something like the turnout rate by registered voters in Wyoming, it's sometimes 100%, sometimes exceeds 100%, because everybody just registers to vote on the day of the election. In California, I think I saw like a question related to California over here in the chat as well. In California, it could happen because California may be slow to engage in what's called voter roll maintenance. So for example, you can imagine lots of people potentially register to vote when they're attending Stanford University, They move away. They take, high-flying jobs in New York City, but they don't remove their name from the list. You can imagine lots of people registering, not having their name removed because people don't really have the incentive to remove their name. As a result of that, you end up with many people who are registered to vote. And perhaps in small population counties that could exceed the number of people in the county. But I think that would be the non-fraud explanation. So it really comes down to voter roll maintenance. In Wyoming, it has this like cool institution. And then just this thing from Marie real quick, I'll just take on. It is the case that in California, the people, when you turn out to vote, people can't ask for your identification. And if you show them your identification, they won't even touch it. They have to, they give you one of these. They'll sort of pull away from it.
So thank you very much, Justin. That was fascinating, and actually, I have to say, a little reassuring. It's nice to know that some problems may be smaller than we thought, and yet it's an issue. Every vote really matters, and voter fraud, if to the extent it exists, also matters. So these are really issues, even if the numbers are small, they're very high stakes to our democracy. So thank you very much for being with us. If we were in person, I would want to lead the crowd in a warm round of applause, but all I can do now is just to say thank you for being with us. Our next constitutional conversation is, correct me if I'm wrong, Chaz, is going to be on October 22nd. And this is going to be Christina Wolbrecht also a political scientist from University of Notre Dame, who's going to be talking about the 19th Amendment, the granting or prohibiting restrictions on the right to vote on the basis of sex. This is the 100th anniversary of the adoption of that amendment, and she's going to be talking about what has been the significance of that for American politics. So please join us again for that program, and thank you, Justin. Thank you, Chaz. But